A high-pitched scream tore through the spring air, followed by the unmistakable thundering of hooves and the sound of plastic chairs flying in every direction. It would have been comical if it weren't so dangerous. Streamers flapped in the wind as terrified partygoers in floral shirts scattered across my pasture, slipping on grass and dodging the 3 massive longhorn bulls that were now calmly trotting among the crowd like they owned the place. And in a way they did. One particularly bold bull stopped to sniff a cake table before flipping it with his horn like a bored toddler with a toy. Off to the side, Karen, the self-declared queen of the HOA, stood frozen near my broken fence, still holding the very garden shears she had used to cut it just hours earlier. Her eyes locked with mine, her jaw dropped, and all I could say was, "You shouldn't have touched the gate." It all started 3 days before that chaos, when I noticed something odd about my side fence. It was a strong, steel-reinforced barrier separating my livestock pen from the HOA property on the other side. I built it that way for a reason, not because I was paranoid or dramatic, but because on the other side lived people who believed the world revolved around them. My bulls were no threat if left alone, but if someone were stupid enough to enter their territory, the result wouldn't be pretty. That day, I saw faint markings on the gate lock and shallow scratches along the edge, like someone had been testing it. I checked the motion sensor logs and saw 2 alerts around midnight the previous night. I checked my cameras and paused. There she was, Karen, holding a flashlight in her mouth and using a tiny metal saw on my padlock like she was in some kind of spy movie. I stood there staring, almost impressed by the stupidity. Karen had always been a problem. She moved into the neighborhood 2 years ago and instantly declared herself president of the HOA by winning a vote nobody else knew was happening. She enforced absurd rules like requiring all trash bins to be the same shade of gray, banning wind chimes over 5 inches long, and once gave a written warning to an old couple for having gnomes that she called psychologically disruptive. Her power trip extended far beyond the HOA lines, though. For months she'd been trying to find a reason to control my property, claiming it was unsightly and dangerous. But I had always stayed just out of her reach. Until she got creative. On Thursday morning, a flyer landed in every mailbox on her side of the community. It read, in bubbly fonts, HOA Spring Fling Garden Party. Location: the scenic open field by the ridge. Food, games, and fun for all. It didn't mention that the so-called scenic field was my private land. And it certainly didn't mention that the other side of the fence led to my working livestock pen. I only found out about the flyer when my neighbor brought one over, chuckling as he said, "I guess you're hosting now." I went over to confront her, but of course, Karen played innocent. She said the flyer was just symbolic, and that it was community space by visual proximity. Whatever that meant. She insisted the fence was unnecessary and that it blocked the view. She actually said that. It blocked the view. Of what exactly the back of my barn my bulls, she didn't care. In her mind, any space not currently occupied by one of her friend's lawn flamingos was public domain. That night, I reinforced the gate again and added a new padlock. I also installed a second trail cam focused on the base of the fence. The next morning, I woke up to find the gate wide open. Not broken. Not forced. Just gone. The entire section had been cleanly cut out and set aside like someone was trying to make a barn-themed runway. And standing in the middle of it, grinning with a clipboard and directing a party tent crew, was Karen. She waved at me like we were old pals and yelled something about adding a bounce house. My jaw clenched so hard I thought I cracked a molar. I told her she had about 30 seconds to clear out before I called the sheriff, but she laughed. She actually laughed and said, "It's too late. Guests are on the way. You'll thank me later." The worst part, one couldn't technically stop her. The section she invaded wasn't marked with no trespassing signs. Something I'd always meant to fix but hadn't gotten around to. And legally, while she was clearly in the wrong, I knew if I pushed too hard without proof, she'd spin it like I was the aggressor. So I decided to wait. I knew the bulls would be back from my friend's ranch that evening. They'd been there for a week, during some pasture renovations. I made a call, moved the timeline up, and by nightfall, they were grazing peacefully inside their pen. Reinforced. Secure. With a digital latch that only responded to my key fob. The next day was the party. Streamers, folding tables, way too many coolers, and a karaoke machine that somehow only played yacht rock. People I'd never seen before roamed my land in polo shirts and wide-brimmed hats, acting like they were on safari. Karen had even set up a drink station labeled HOA VIP Lounge under a fake cabana. But the real show started around 4 p.m. A little boy, probably 6 or 7, ran over to the gate and started tugging at it. One of the adults, some guy in cargo shorts who looked like he hadn't seen a tool in a decade, helped him open it, thinking it was just a decorative arch. What came next was a blur of dust, snorts, and unholy screeches as my 3 bulls, Tank, Diesel, and Whiskey, took center stage. They didn't charge. They weren't aggressive. But they were territorial. Their presence alone was enough to spark pure panic. One woman dove into a cooler. A man tried to scale a plastic table and fell flat on his back. A group of teenagers ran into a patch of thistles. Karen was frozen in place, eyes wide, lips trembling, holding a skewer of grilled pineapple like it was a magic wand. I stepped up onto the slope behind the barn, remote in hand, and blew the recall whistle. The bulls halted mid-step, then turned and slowly returned to the pen, as if they were actors finishing a scene. Nobody clapped. Nobody breathed. And then, just as Karen turned to yell something, my camera drone buzzed above and hovered right over her. The red light blinked. Recording. She dropped the garden shears. The game had just begun. The morning after the chaos, I woke up to 2 things. One was a voicemail from Deputy Allen asking me to bring in my footage, and the other was a community group chat notification from the HOA app titled, Incident at the Field. Emergency HOA meeting tonight. I didn't need to open it to know who wrote it. Karen was going to try damage control, but she had no idea how deep of a hole she'd just dug herself into. Before anything else, I grabbed my hard drives, the drone footage, and a fresh cup of coffee, then sat back to watch the spectacle I'd recorded the day before. What played on screen was part comedy, part courtroom exhibit, and part karma in high definition. The footage started with her laughing while clipping my lock like it was a minor inconvenience, then transitioned to her ushering in party guests while bragging about how she solved the ugly fence problem. Then came the bull gate moment, the chaos, the screaming, and the way she turned ghost white when she saw the drone overhead. It was better than I remembered. Around noon, I drove down to the sheriff's office to meet with Deputy Allen. He was already familiar with the situation, having responded to Karen's frantic call the previous day claiming that I deliberately unleashed wild bulls to trample children. When I handed him the footage and explained how my bulls were trained under federal agricultural crowd control programs, his eyebrows shot up. He leaned back, smirked, and muttered, "So she cut your fence, threw an illegal party on your land, and now wants to charge you with biological warfare?" I nodded. He chuckled, shook his head, and said he'd be filing a formal report to forward to the county prosecutor. He also advised I document everything and prepare for what he called Karen's legal temper tantrum. I spent the rest of the day printing photos of the broken gate, screenshotting timestamps, and organizing everything into a case folder. Meanwhile, I got texts from several neighbors, some I barely knew, expressing sympathy, embarrassment, and even quiet applause. Apparently, Karen's garden party had become the neighborhood's most talked about disaster. One woman wrote, "My son is still talking about the bull that flipped the grill. Honestly, best party he's ever been to." Another said, "Can I rent your bulls the next time my in-laws visit?" Word was spreading, and not in Karen's favor. By the time the HOA's emergency meeting rolled around that evening, I had decided to attend. Not to argue, but to observe. I sat quietly in the back of the clubhouse while Karen stood at the front, wearing a pastel blazer and a neck brace she definitely wasn't wearing earlier. She claimed she was injured during the stampede, and held a crumpled flyer in her hand like it was a declaration of innocence. She told the group that I had installed dangerous exotic animals without notice and that my property should be subject to new inspections and security protocols. She called it a public safety risk that affects all of us. I waited for someone to say something. No one did. Until finally, one of the older board members, a guy named Ron who rarely spoke, raised his hand and said, "Karen, didn't you cut his fence?" She stammered, turned red and said, "That's irrelevant. The point is," he retaliated. I raised my hand. She froze when she saw me, like she just spotted a judge in the audience at a traffic court. I calmly asked if I could speak, then stepped forward with a small stack of printed photos. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't get dramatic. I just laid out the facts. I showed her using bolt cutters on my lock. I showed her directing the party setup crew inside my property lines. I showed the footage of the gate being opened, the bulls walking in calmly, and the aftermath. I even showed a frame of her standing next to a hand-lettered sign reading, HOA Event Zone, placed in my field without permission. When I finished, the room was dead silent. Karen tried to pivot. She said I was weaponizing livestock to intimidate her. I replied that I had state licenses and training credentials for crowd-controlled livestock. She claimed I had set her up. I asked why, if that were true. She was caught on camera laughing after cutting my fence. She had no answer. Finally, someone from the audience muttered, "Karen, maybe sit down." That broke the tension. A few people chuckled. Ron whispered something to the treasurer, who nodded. Then the VP of the HOA, clearly trying to distance herself from the train wreck, said the board would review the footage and issue a private statement later in the week. Karen tried one last plea, accusing me of humiliating her in front of the community. I said I didn't humiliate her. She just finally got caught in front of a camera. Over the next 2 days, the community response was overwhelming. The HOA group chat exploded with debate. Some defended Karen, but most were furious at how she had exposed children to danger, lied about her actions, and tried to spin the story as if she were the victim. Someone created a meme showing her standing near the bulls with a speech bubble that said, "Just add glitter, it'll be fine." Another neighbor printed a sign and posted it near the ridge, "Private property, now with extra horns. Enter at your own risk." Karen demanded the sign be taken down. It wasn't. Meanwhile, I filed a civil complaint for trespassing, property damage, and endangerment. I didn't want money, I wanted it on record. And as expected, Karen responded with a counterclaim, alleging trauma, injury, and loss of reputation. Her lawyer was some local guy who advertised on benches and promised results in under 30 days or your next consultation free. I wasn't worried. I had evidence, witnesses, and a mountain of common sense on my side. She had a brace she bought online and a badly photoshopped picture of the bulls with red eyes. No, seriously, she tried to present an edited image where one of the bulls looked like it belonged in a horror movie. It only made her case look worse. But the real twist came when I received a call from a regional agricultural official who had seen the footage. Turns out, he used to work in the same federal training program I'd collaborated with years ago. He asked if I'd consider helping teach a new livestock safety course using the footage from the HOA party as a real-life example. I laughed so hard I nearly dropped the phone. He was serious. He said it was a prime example of how misjudging livestock, property boundaries, and ego could lead to massive liability, and that no staged video could ever top the authenticity of a real event. I told him I'd think about it. But deep down, I knew the answer was yes. Karen had tried to ruin me and had ended up turning my bulls into training stars. Now it wasn't just about settling a neighborhood feud. It was about proving that sometimes, when people think they're untouchable, the best teacher is a bull named Diesel with a nose for justice. 2 weeks had passed since the infamous bull incident, and yet the ripples were still spreading across the community like wildfire in dry brush. You'd think after a herd of trained longhorns marched through a backyard luau and flipped over a buffet table, people would be a little more cautious. But somehow, Karen managed to spin her embarrassment into a bizarre badge of honor. She began telling people she survived a targeted livestock ambush and was now recovering from trauma while bravely continuing her duties as HOA president. I heard from my mail carrier that she'd started wearing sunglasses in public to avoid press attention, even though no actual reporter had written a single word about her. She wanted to be a martyr, but nobody was buying it. Especially not after my footage made its quiet debut at the county office, submitted as part of my trespassing complaint. The footage circulated quickly. A county agriculture officer forwarded it to a few colleagues, and within a few days, it ended up in the hands of a livestock behavior specialist in Austin. Then it made the rounds in a few law enforcement training circles, particularly the part where my bulls cornered the DJ without touching him and stood motionless until recalled. Suddenly, I was getting emails asking if I'd consider hosting training sessions or participating in seminars. A couple of universities even reached out, wanting to study the bulls' responses and behaviors in chaotic environments. Karen might have tried to humiliate me, but she accidentally launched a side business I didn't even know I needed. Of course, not everyone in the HOA community was pleased. There was a small group still clinging to Karen's version of events, claiming I had overreacted and weaponized animals for intimidation. One woman even suggested my barn had a secret underground lair full of military-grade livestock. I wasn't sure if she was joking, but I didn't care. For every ridiculous rumor they started, I had twice as many people calling to ask if they could tour the ranch or learn how to work with animals like mine. I even gave Tank his own social media account just for fun, and it somehow gained over 6,000 followers in a week. The most popular video was him calmly nudging a folding chair with his horn and then walking away like a bouncer at a nightclub. Meanwhile, Karen's countersuit had officially been filed, and it was every bit as absurd as I expected. Her lawyer, who looked like he printed his own business cards on a library printer, claimed my property was a deliberate hazard to public health, that my bulls had intent to intimidate, and that I had created a psychological atmosphere of fear. They included stills from the party footage, which they tried to frame as evidence of deliberate negligence. One of the images showed a child running from the bulls, which would have been compelling if the child hadn't tripped over a decorative flamingo and the bull hadn't been on the opposite end of the pasture at the time. I handed all of this to my attorney, who nearly burst out laughing after reading the complaint. She pointed out at least a dozen contradictions in the filing, including the fact that Karen claimed physical injuries that were never reported by any medical professional, plus multiple timelines that didn't match up. My lawyer compiled a response that was calm, surgical, and devastating. It included affidavits from my vet, the local sheriff, 2 parents from the party, and even the HOA vice president, who finally turned on Karen publicly after seeing how far she was willing to take her lies. The court date was set for early next month, and until then, Karen kept digging herself deeper. She began sending HOA-wide emails with long, dramatic rants titled things like "A Leader's Burden" and "When the System Fails Us." These were meant to rally support but mostly ended up being shared around with sarcastic commentary. My favorite was someone replying, "Karen, it was a birthday party, not the Battle of Troy." Slowly, her allies started peeling off, realizing that not only was she wrong, but she was making the neighborhood look ridiculous. A few even apologized to me in private, including a board member who said, "I didn't think it was that serious until I saw her chopping your fence on camera like she was defusing a bomb." Around this time, something unexpected happened. I received an envelope in my mailbox with no return address. Inside was a USB stick and a single note that said, "You didn't hear this from me." I plugged it in cautiously, expecting it to be a prank or worse, but it turned out to be security camera footage. Clear, close-up video from one of the HOA members' home systems. It showed Karen and 2 friends, the night before the party, cutting my fence, laughing, and then rehearsing what to say if someone asks whose land it is. One of them actually said, "Just act confused. He'll get over it." The video was time-stamped, high quality, and damning. I brought the footage to my attorney, who immediately added it to our growing evidence file. It showed premeditated trespassing, deliberate destruction of private property, and a clear plan to lie about it afterward. At this point, we didn't even have to push for financial damages. We were going to walk into that courtroom and make her look like a cartoon villain with garden tools. But I had one more card to play before that. The next HOA meeting came just days after we added the new footage to our case, and I decided it was time to stop sitting quietly in the back. I arrived early, set up a small projector and screen, and waited. Karen showed up looking smug, wearing another one of her exaggerated neck braces, and sat at the front. She didn't acknowledge me. The room filled quickly. This time, everyone wanted to see what was coming. When the meeting opened, I asked if I could share something with the group. Karen tried to object, but the board allowed it. I dimmed the lights and hit play. The room went silent as the footage showed her slicing open the fence, directing people onto my land, and laughing about it. The moment it ended, I said nothing. I didn't need to. The silence was louder than anything I could have said. Karen stood up, red-faced, shaking,